jump right in, and we're off, I think. Here we go. So this book got started about 2017, right after the inauguration. The idea of presidential insults was sort of in the air, and I decided to look at how presidents had been insulted since the beginning of the Republic. Three things stood out to me as I did this research, or after I did this research. One is that things haven't changed that much. The second thing was that trying to curtail insults to a president never really works. The idea of freedom of speech guaranteed by the First Amendment is really something that has been pretty robustly defended since the beginning of the Republic. Lots of presidents have tried to curtail it. It's never really worked. The third thing I noticed was that the way we insult presidents is fairly consistent over time. The actual words change. We don't really talk about scamps that much, but the basic categories of insults are relatively consistent. So we'll take a look at some of that. And here, of course, you have the various targets of insults, some of whom have also been insulters themselves. We like to think of the beginning of the American Republic as this time of great civility and seriousness. If you go to the Capitol, you see all these staid paintings, people handing documents to one another, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and so on. But as this cartoon from 1798 suggests, it was really a bit more raucous. And the two gentlemen on the my right of the screen, one's holding a pair of tongs and the other is holding a walking stick. They were two congressmen who got into a fist fight. One spit on the other beat the other with the tongs. It was quite a sort of raucous time, and this is a little bit more accurate to the tone of the era. Even George Washington, who we think of as universally loved, had plenty of detractors. His vice president, John Adams, referred to him as Old Muttonhead, and said that he was so stupid that the only reason he hadn't been found out was that he kept his mouth shut so well. This is, by the way, an image from the Dangerous Crooked Scoundrels by the artist Morgan Pielli, who's done some beginning of the chapter artwork. One of Washington's great detractors was Thomas Paine, the author of Common Sense. The two had a falling out. Paine wrote to Washington on his birthday, received no answer, and then later put together an 8,000-word booklet attacking Washington. Among other things, he referred to him as the world will be puzzled to decide whether you're an apostate or an imposter, whether you have abandoned good principles or whether you ever had any. He also referred to him as chameleon-colored, hypocritical, and pusillanimous, which was a great favorite insult among the founders. Well, those of you that have read some history probably remember the election of 1800 and 1796, when John Adams and Jefferson faced off against each other. Adams won the first election, Jefferson the second, and the sort of battle between them was between Adams, who was characterized as a gross hypocrite, one of the most egregious fools on the continent, and was referred to as having a hideous hermaphroditical character, which was not a gender insult, but really referred to him as being a wishy-washy politician. One of the great insult books of the time was this book called The Prospect Before Us, by a writer that Jefferson actually hired to do the character assassination for him. Jefferson, in turn, was referred to as a dastardly poltroon. That's what Adams called him. Um, poltroon is just another word for coward. So dastardly poltroon was basically a cowardly coward. Um, Others refer to him as a brandy-soaked defamer of churches for his views on freedom of religion, and a howling atheist. Here are some images of Jefferson, by the way. One of them shows him about to burn the Constitution, but he's stopped by the American eagle, and you have that all-seeing eye up there. The other one refers to Jefferson's apparent predilection for things French. He's spinning up money to give to Napoleon for the Louisiana Purchase. And in the corner up there, you see Napoleon as a bumblebee stinging the hyena Jefferson, or the prairie dog. The next two presidents were basically proteges of Jefferson, and Madison was referred to as Jefferson's political pimp, a mere puppet, and the little pygmy. Madison was 5'4", and his wife Dolly Madison dwarfed him somewhat. She was also attacked in the press, which is a whole nother story that I'll get into at some point. James Monroe, the last of that founding generation, was called a fawning parasite and a dull, sleepy, insignificant-looking man who hasn't got brains enough to hold his hat on. That was from someone who attended his inauguration. So early on, you start to see some of the themes for insulting presidents. They're lazy, they're puppets, right? Puppets of Napoleon, puppets of the French. They're cowardly, they're traitorous. Later on, we'll see them referred to as quarrelsome, drunks, despots, immoral, and so on. The later presidents, John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, who followed James Monroe, was referred to as perverse and mulish as his father, clownish, and Andrew Jackson called him an old lying scamp, which scamp was much more of an insult at the time. It's not quite that Dennis the Menace, troublesome kid sort of image that we have today. Jackson and Adams, of course, were locked in a two-election battle. Adams won the first election in the Electoral College. No one won a majority. The four candidates at the time were thrown into the House of Representatives to decide. Henry Clay dropped out, threw his support to Adams, and the election was given to the candidate who didn't have the highest number of popular votes, Adams. Jackson, in turn, started running immediately for the 1828 election, and where he ousted Adams. Jackson was the first sort of popular president, first man of the people president, but he was also a sort of rough character. His wife was attacked because she had been married before, and it wasn't quite clear whether she had been divorced before or after she married Jefferson. So she was referred to as a bigamist. Jackson himself, a man of violent temper and very moderate talents. That was Alexander de Tocqueville when he visited the new United States. A confidence man with his painted woman. He'll be the first president to be referred to as a con man. And the fireside hyena of character. So these are just a few of the insults associated with these characters. Well, Jackson was often portrayed in imagery as stepping on the Constitution and having monarchical designs. You can sort of see him there, King Andrew I, of veto memory, born to command. Had I been consulted. And again, down at the bottom, standing on the Constitution. This month, by the way, is Constitution Day. And if you look back at the Jefferson cartoons and the Jackson ones and some of the other ones, a running theme is presidents tearing up or abusing the Constitution. So we'll see that again and again. Well, after Jackson was followed by Martin VanBuren, who just served one term. He maneuvered himself into the vice presidency in Jackson's second term, replacing John C. Calhoun. So there was quite a bit of intrigue in Jackson's cabinet. VanBuren's great nemesis was a man that you may know from another venue. It was the Congressman David Crockett, Tennessee Congressman. We know him more as Davy Crockett, the king of the wild frontier, but he was also a Whig congressman. And he co-authored a book, a biography of VanBuren, which was basically a 200 pages rather, of attacks on VanBuren's character and background. Among other things, he referred to him as a secret, sly, selfish, cold, calculating, distrustful, treacherous little man. One of the early examples of a just sort of throwing a lot of spaghetti at the wall and seeing what will stick. I'm not going to mention every president, just a few. There were 45 of them, so it's a little. It would take a bit longer than we have. But I did want to mention John Tyler, the first vice president to become president. He was the second part of Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And when William Henry Harrison died about 30 days into his term, Tyler became the object of a lot of speculation in the cabinet, whether he should be called the interim president or the acting president or what. Tyler just resolved the issue by taking the oath of office and saying that he was now the president. The various other people referred to him as an ignoramus, as an illiterate. One of my favorite insults to Tyler was actually delivered by a friend of his when the widower Tyler remarried a 25-year-old woman. Tyler was about 50 at the time, and his friend referred to him as a poor, unfortunate, deluded old jackass for marrying such a young woman. Tyler had the last laugh. Between his 2 marriages, he had 15 children. So not much of a president, but a prolific father. Franklin Pierce. Pierce was one of the many presidents who had issues with drinking. He actually died of cirrhosis of the liver. So he was a New Hampshire Democrat at the beginning of the 1850s, and he was referred to as Fainting Frank for an episode in which he fell off a horse. And his political opponents referred to him as the hero of many a well-fought battle. James Buchanan, another Democrat who followed Pierce after the electorate had enough of him, was referred to as a bloated mass of political putridity by his political opponents. And here are a couple of cartoons of the time that represent Pierce and Buchanan. On the left, you've got the social qualities of our candidate, and you can see Frank Pierce there with a bottle. Not sure what the owl is about. And on the other side, you've got James Buchanan facing down the South Carolina's ultimatum. And he's basically, even though the South is about to shoot itself in the crotch, it looks like, Buchanan backs down and lets them secede. Well, Buchanan, of course, was followed by the nation's first Republican president, Abe Lincoln. You've got the image here of Lincoln, again, allowing the Constitution to burn. And again, he suspended various constitutional protections, instituted censorship for a time, but finally came to his senses. He was referred to as nothing more than a well-meaning baboon and the original gorilla by some of the members of his cabinet, his Secretary of War and his Attorney General. He was also referred to as wishy-washy by his own Republican Party for not prosecuting the war aggressively enough. One of the early uses of wishy-washy to refer to a president. And during the election of 1860, he was considered a slang-wanging stump speaker. He was attacked as being vulgar in his speech, being much too folksy, and employing a sort of low style of speech. So everything from his looks to his prosecution of the war to his speaking style were attacked. And there are actually a couple of books out there that are basically track all the attacks leveled at Lincoln. So there are whole book-length studies of how Lincoln was insulted and vilified by Northerners and Southerners alike. Here's one more cartoon of the time that gives you a sense of how Lincoln was perceived by people who were skeptical of him. Mr. Lincoln, give me back my 500,000 sons. Well, the fact is, by the way, that reminds me of a story. His sort of folksy manner. Well, following Lincoln, we find Andrew Johnson, who began his career as a tailor. The press of the time referred to him as the drunken tailor. And the reason he got that nickname was that at his inauguration in 1865 as vice president, the story goes that Johnson had a bad cold and had been drinking rum to fight off the cold, and he appeared incoherent. So many Republicans who sort of resented this unity ticket of Lincoln and Johnson thought that he was just a crude drunk, and Lincoln had to defend him. At one point he said, "Andy ain't no drunk." The man who succeeded him, Ulysses S. Grant, also had a falling out with Johnson and referred to him as an infernal liar. Johnson, of course, was impeached, and some of his comments about his political opponents were used in the impeachment trial. In particular, at one point, Johnson was giving a speech somewhere in the South. Someone shouted out from the audience that his political opponents should be hanged, and Johnson, never one to miss an opportunity to demagogue, said that, yes, why not hang them? And that became some evidence in his impeachment. And here again, you see the little boy who would persist in handling books beyond his capacity, and the Constitution flattens him out there. Ulysses Grant followed Johnson. Grant actually considered running for a third term, and he declined to do it at the end, but he was having money troubles and thought that maybe he should get back into politics. You'll recall that he sort of died of throat cancer in 1870. I forget exactly when he passed away, but he died of throat cancer not long after he stopped being president from the cigars and whiskey. He was considered as not a very bright character. Some of the Republicans said that U.S. Grant stood for uniquely stupid, and one of the members of his own party said he should have lived in a cave and worn skins. Another said that he doesn't have an idea beyond a horse and a cigar. And Grant was known as a feisty sort of president. One of the Republican senators said that he was a great presidential quarreler with more quarrels than all other presidents together, all begun and continued by himself. So again, you can see a theme that maybe recurs later on. So here's Grant stumbling his way to a third term. Will he make it? And see that second term up there. So this is in the middle of it, but he tried the third term. I'm going to skip ahead. There are a series of presidents at the end of the 19th century, a number of bearded Ohioans and others, Grover Cleveland, perhaps the most interesting. But things get much more interesting around the turn of the 20th century with Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt replaced the sitting vice president who had died in office. So William McKinley was the elected president in 1896. His vice president died, and they chose Teddy Roosevelt in part, many thought, to get him out of the New York governorship. They thought that the vice presidency would be a place where he would do no harm. McKinley's handler, Mark Hanna, though, had an inkling of what might happen. And at one point he said, "There's only a heartbeat between that madman and the presidency." Well, among the other insults that were directed at Teddy Roosevelt, he started out as a kind of overly fancy dressed character in the New York Assembly, and they referred to him as a Jane Dandy, and our own Oscar Wilde. So he was considered something of a duded up type character. When he took his trip out to the Badlands, he sort of came back as a cowboy, and Henry James referred to him as a dangerous and ominous jingo for the transformation that Teddy undertook from being a kind of fancy pants to being a rough rider. In the cartoon, you see his legendary "speak softly and carry a big stick," and he's wiping his feet on the Constitution there. His political opponents referred to him as the greatest faker of all times. The bellhop of Wall Street, although he was known as a trust buster, many progressives thought that he didn't go quite far enough. Mark Twain, still active at the time, simply referred to him as clearly insane. And one of the insults that I had to look up, they referred to him as a thimble rigger plying his vocation among the rural visitors to the Midway Plaisance. Thimble rigger is basically someone who does the shell game, right? So the idea was that he was a con man at the boardwalk, basically. A con man at the fair. So a thimble rigger was basically the shell game. You put a pea under a thimble and shuffle it around, tricking the public. Well, Roosevelt served until 1909, and he was succeeded by William Howard Taft, who had been a great friend of Roosevelt's. Taft's father was a member of, I think, Grant's cabinet, old Ohio family. And Taft wanted to have a judgeship, but he was appointed Governor General of the Philippines by McKinley. Teddy Roosevelt brought him back to this mainland and picked him as his successor. It was a sort of contest between Charles Edmund Hughes, also a popular Republican at the time, and Taft. And Roosevelt finally settled on his protege Taft. But the conventional wisdom of the time was that Taft was much too much Teddy's creature. People said that the name Taft stood for taking advice from Theodore, T-A-F-T. And here, a couple of the cartoons at the time. Bill, you look so much better in your own clothes, not trying to wear Teddy's Rough Rider costume. And the other one is Teddy looking in the window and sort of looking askance at Taft, who seems to be getting tangled up in all sorts of things. Taft was sort of prone to misspeaking, and one of the names that was associated with him, people started to call him Mr. Malaprop. So that was before some of the later misspeaking presidents, but he was referred to as Mr. Malaprop, and he became so unpopular later that they referred to him as the VanBuren of his party. Well, the big falling out, though, was between Teddy and Taft. You recall they ran against each other in the 1912 election. It was one of those great four-candidate elections featuring Taft as the Republican candidate, Teddy Roosevelt as the candidate of the Bull Moose or Progressive Party. And it was the first election in which there were primaries. And Teddy actually ended up with more primary wins and votes than Taft did, but the Republican establishment had had enough of Teddy Roosevelt and gave the nomination to Taft. Also in the running, Woodrow Wilson and Eugene V. Debs, the socialist candidate. But the big sort of insult debate was between Taft and Teddy. Teddy referred to Taft as a fathead, a man with brains of about 3 guinea pig power, a puzzlewit, and a flub-dub with the streak of the second rate and the common in it. So there's some great old words that we don't hear much anymore, puzzlewit and flub-dub, which I think we should bring back. Taft called Teddy a demagogue and a flatterer. And the one that is sort of my favorite, he called him a freak and a honeyfuggler. So a honeyfuggler, it's not what it sounds like. A honeyfuggler is basically a schmoozer. It's an old Ohio sort of Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee term for somebody who gets their way by sort of promising things that they don't intend to follow through on. A sweet talker. And it can be spelled either with 1 G or 2. Well, Teddy and Taft sort of canceled each other out, and Woodrow Wilson, the former college professor, college president, was elected in 1912, served 2 terms. People referred to him as the devil, our Caesar for the suspension of civil liberties during World War I and also the Red Scare. He was a cold person, a human icicle. They saw him as something of a two-faced flip-flopper. So one of his opponents said, to call Mr. Wilson a weathercock is unfair to weathercocks, so a weather vane. A strutting pedagogue, and an unctuous charlatan. Teddy Roosevelt had a lot to say about Wilson as well. So here are some of the things that Teddy said. That he was a prime jackass, a Byzantine logothete. A logothete, by the way, I had to look this up, and the newspaper reporters of the time also had to look it up. There were several sidebars at the time explaining that this was a Teddy Rooseveltism, and all of the reporters had to go look up what a logothete was. So a Byzantine logothete was basically an accountant of Byzantium. A less virile me, yellow all through, a trained elocutionist, and neither a gentleman nor a real man. And here again, you see this idea of some candidates as being all talk and no action. So they've got Woodrow Wilson, the word wizard. Some clever alliteration there. Well, Wilson was followed by, well, one of my favorites for insults, Warren G. Harding, the politician who referred to a return to normalcy. Harding was a small town newspaper man from Ohio who sort of was known for drinking whiskey, smoking cigars, and having extramarital sex. He referred to himself as a man of limited talents from a small town. But he sort of looked presidential. And the country wanted a sort of quiet time. One of his political opponents just referred to him as a spineless sort of individual. Teddy Roosevelt's daughter said he was just a slob. The legendary Kansas newspaperman William Allen White said he was a he-harlot. The president of Columbia University referred to him as a cheese paring of a man. And E. Cummings, when Harding died, said that he was the only man, woman, or child who wrote a simple declarative sentence with 7 grammatical errors. Harding, by the way, was taking a Western train trip when he had a heart attack and died. And later on, the rumors were that his wife had actually poisoned him. So there was a scandalous book that came out a few years after Harding's death that accused her of engineering his death, but it later proved to be a hoax. I'm going to skip ahead now to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt served 12 years as president, so he got quite a lot of vitriol thrown at him. And again, here you see a president canceling the Constitution of the United States. One congressperson from the upper Midwest called him a crazy, conceited megalomaniac. He was also called a honeyfuggler, a prize honeyfuggler. Alice Roosevelt Longworth referred to him as 90% Eleanor and 10% mush. And he got attacked from both the left and the right. The left called him a scab president for some of his efforts to hire non-union labor, and folks on the right referred to him as a rainy day plutocrat. right? Traitor to his class. Some other ones. Here's another great Constitution cartoon. I'm glad you dug up your Constitution, Joe. I can't find ours. So there you've got Stalin on one side and FDR on the other. A moose jaw and a mama's boy, a chameleon on plaid, a gibbering idiot, and a quack. Those were all things that Herbert Hoover said about him. A traitor to his class, and a Wall Street tool. So again, the left and the right. I'll sort of move ahead a little bit and talk about some of the presidents that followed in the second half of the 20th century. Harry Truman, who succeeded FDR, was referred to as a vulgar little Babbitt. That was by Henry Luce, the publisher of Time magazine, invoking the Sinclair Lewis sort of small-minded, small-town person, Babbitt. The Chicago Tribune, by the way, referred to Truman as a nincompoop, but again, the Tribune later had to eat their words when they published the Dewey defeats Truman headline later that year. Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a sort of nominal Republican. He beat the sort of established Republican favorite, Robert Taft, the son of William Howard, and several of them. One of the Republican insults at the time about Eisenhower was that he was a good-looking mortician, sort of a celebrity candidate rather than a substantive candidate. But Eisenhower turned out to have had a sort of quiet appeal, but many on the right sort of found time to attack him. Among those were the editor of the Manchester Union Leader, who was famous for alliterative insults, and he referred to him as Dopey Dwight. Later on, the Manchester Union Leader would refer to Jerry Ford as Jerry the Jerk, part of their continued trend of alliteration. John F. Kennedy, Bertrand Russell said that Kennedy was more wicked than Hitler. Russell was upset because of the nuclear, the continuation of nuclear testing. Detractors in the South attacked him for his regionalism, Mr. Boston Beans. I think that Beans is sort of a flatulence joke, perhaps. Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, again, lots of invective. One of my favorites about Johnson was from his roving ambassador, Averell Harriman, who said that he was a real centaur, part man, part horse's ass. And another of my favorites, this one from Hunter S. Thompson, who called Nixon, used some parallelism here to refer to Richard Nixon as a swine of a man and a jabbering dupe of a president. And here's a cartoon, sort of attempted censorship. You've got the scissors on the one hand, and you've got sort of the image of Nixon on one part of the scissors, and on the other side was John Mitchell, his Attorney General. Again, perhaps a sort of familiar linkage there. Well, a move ahead to the next series of presidents, next kind of clump. Gerald Ford, Ford began his presidency by reminding people that he was a Ford, not a Lincoln, kind of self-deprecating characterization. One of his own staff members said that he was like Eisenhower without the medals. And a commentator in the New York Times referred to him as a fine-looking man in a Lake Wobegon sort of way. So lowered expectations. Jimmy Carter, again, the sort of target of lots of invective. Eugene McCarthy, the famous poet politician from the 1960s, who was still running in 1976, referred to Carter as an oratorical mortician who inters his words and ideas beneath piles of syntactical mush. One of the insults that I thought was particularly funny was from Bob Dole, who ran against, he ran as Ford's vice president in 1976 against a team of Carter and Mondale, and he referred to Carter as a Southern Fried McGovern. Later on, Dole retracted that and said he had too much respect for George McGovern. Ronald Reagan, target of plenty of insults. Again, one of my favorites, Margaret Thatcher, simply said that there's nothing between his ears. George Bush, this is a great old Southern politician, Bill Baxley, who was the Attorney General of Alabama at the time, one of the last Democrats there to be elected statewide. He referred to Bush as a pinstripe and polo playing, umbrella toting Ivy Leaguer, born with a silver spoon so far back in his mouth that you couldn't get it out with a crowbar. One of those long-winded, throw everything at them insults. Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. Clinton was characterized as a nerdy little flower child peacenik demonstrating against his country during the 1992 election. That was from a Republican congressman from California. George Bush, Tony Kushner, the playwright, simply referred to him as a feckless, blood-spattered plutocrat. And here are two insults from Doonesbury. The one on the left of the screen, Bill Clinton, portrayed as a waffle, trying to get universal health care, universal coverage or nothing. Okay, 90%. I can live with 70%. And the other one, George W. Bush, was portrayed as an asterisk under a cowboy hat. Let me just say something about the legitimacy of my presidency, my president-electcy. And bringing us up to the present, we've got a couple more cartoons of presidents being characterized as disregarding the Constitution. Here's Barack Obama taking some executive action and changing the Constitution from we the people to me the people. And in another sort of little bit of pronoun legerdemain, you've got Donald Trump dressed as a founding father, and the caption on the Constitution is "I the people." So to choose your pronoun. And again, some other, Obama was characterized as people attempted to other him as a Kenyan, right? A Kenyan cream puff, among other things. So they combine the othering with the idea of being a cream puff. Donald Trump, this one came from another Republican, Arnold Schwarzenegger, former governor of California. After the Helsinki summit, Schwarzenegger said that Trump stood there next to Putin like a little wet noodle, like a little fanboy. I think he said it in his bodybuilder voice. So just to start to wrap up, leave some time for question and answers. The art of the insult. How do you go about insulting a president? Right? Well, I think there are 4 things that good insults have. You want to sort of capture the moment. What are people thinking about? And just to give you one example, the insult from the Colorado Congresswoman Patricia Schroeder about Ronald Reagan. She referred to him as a Teflon-coated president. It later got morphed into the Teflon president, but the idea was that he had the sort of personality where he could make all these mistakes and say all sorts of outrageous things, and none of them would stick to him. And that sort of captured the public's impression of Reagan at the time. So he became known as the Teflon president. You want something that's memorable, something that's fresh enough to stick in people's minds. So I keep coming back to things like a cheese paring of a man for Warren Harding. You want to try to be specific. Okay? So not just call somebody a jerk or a loser, but come up with an insult that gives them something to create an image. So the view of James Monroe as being so dumb that he can't keep his hat on. His head's so small he can't keep his hat on. Nothing to hang his hat on. And then embracing the poetry of language. And again, one of the great ones that do this are the ones that use some parallelism, right? So something like that Hunter S. Thompson, a jabbering dupe of a president. So if you're going to craft your own insults, think about what are people thinking about, what's going to be memorable, what's going to be specific, and what's got some poetry to it. Finally, I was going to leave you with one of my favorite insults. One of my favorites was from Clarence Darrow, the famous lawyer, about Warren Harding. And he just referred to him as a human smudge. Right? That's one of those sort of images that sticks with you. So here's a bit more artwork from Morgan Pielli. Mount Rushmore. The Dangerous Crooked Scoundrels cover. And I'm going to stop the sharing now and see what questions folks might have.
All right, everyone. So like I said, you can type your questions into the chat box. I do have one question here for you, Ed. This one is from Maureen. So many historical references to trampling on the Constitution. Were these real challenges to the Constitution as they are today, or were they media manipulations?
Oh, well, I think at the time people thought they were quite serious. The Jefferson's sort of expansion of presidential power, Jackson's vetoes, and his sort of standing up to Congress in the nullification crisis, certainly Lincoln's expanding presidential power during the Civil War, and things like Franklin Roosevelt's court packing scheme when the Supreme Court kept thwarting his attempts to pull the country out of the Depression.
All right, I've got a question here from Gary. So how would you say presidential insults have changed in the past 25 years, or have they?
Oh yeah, how have they changed? Well, they've with the certainly with cable television and the social media, they've become much more intensified. So it used to be that you'd have an insult, people would discuss it for a couple of days, and it would sort of go away. But now it gets kind of continuously recycled, both by fans, detractors, um, Russian bots, the media, and so on. So there's a lot more competition to make something newsworthy. Um, and as a result, I think the insults get a little less erudite. So you really don't have the sort of Teddy Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy insults where they were sort of they were sort of playing to the educated audience. They were playing to the media elite. Now it's really much more sort of playing to the groundlings.
All right, Daniel asks, when did a president give back insults as good as he got?
Oh yeah, so I think Teddy Roosevelt was sort of a um, he's the one that I think of as having the most wit in giving back insults. A lot of other presidents were just sort of offended. You know, Washington was sort of quietly offended. Um, Lincoln tended to turn the other cheek. He was much more, he would sort of give it back quietly in sort of private meetings. Um, Someone like Grover Cleveland would write letters to the editors of Punch magazines and others saying that never before in the history of the Republic has there a president been so vilified. Um, so you think Teddy Roosevelt could give it back quite well. Someone like Barack Obama, he really was much more just let it roll off him. We sort of see how Donald Trump is. Kind of no insult goes unanswered. So each one had their own kind of style and personality.
So you just said something that reminded me of a question I wanted to ask. It seems like every president in my lifetime has said, or their following has said, never in the history of the United States has a president been insulted or treated so poorly. In your research, did you come across one that you think maybe did get it a little bit more? Oh, sorry, maybe did get it a little bit more than anyone else?
Oh yeah. Well, some of the ones who served a very short time had a lot of detractors before they were president. So I managed to find a dozen or so insults for William Henry Harrison, who only served 30 days. I think Franklin Roosevelt was in office for a long time, and one of the things that strikes me is he got it from both sides, and I think Lincoln as well. Lincoln, Jefferson, Roosevelt are probably the most vilified from the most directions.
All right, do we have any more questions? We can give you just a moment to type another question in if you have any others. So Ed, my question is, I know you said you started researching this shortly after 2017 or 2016 election. What exactly was it that made you say, I want to know more about this topic and I want other people to know more about this topic?
Yeah, it was actually a conversation with an editor that I was working with, and we were talking about the 2016 election and the number of insults that particularly came from Donald Trump, but where there was some on all sides. And we were sort of lamenting the fact that the insults weren't very good. I mean, I remember growing up in New Jersey, there would be sort of middle school insults like, they had to put a pork chop around your neck to get a dog to play with you. Or if they put your brain on the edge of a razor blade, it would look like a BB rolling down a 4-lane highway. Things like that, that had some, they were sort of showy and clever. And it seemed to me that a lot of the insults in the 2016 election were sort of not that great. So we're talking about this and kind of lamenting the fact that there are all these great books about British insults, the wit and wisdom of Winston Churchill and sort of Oscar Wilde and things like that, but nothing really comparable for American politics. And the editor invited me to put together a proposal, so I did. And then, you know, the next couple of summers, I spent a lot of time just researching all sorts of insults and fact checking, and then kind of winnowing it down to the ones that weren't too repetitive, which is a little tricky, because for some people you could have had, you know, some of the more recent presidents, you could have had 50 insults. As I got closer to the present day rather, I expanded the number from, say, a dozen to about 20 or so. But so that was sort of the genesis of the project.
Great. I'm so glad that you took that on so that now we can learn more about it.
And in the end of the book, there's actually a little glossary of all the insults. So if you want to sort of look through, and you can see that there are some by different categories. So if you want to create your own insults for any candidate of your choice, there's a useful guide at the end of the book.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Battistella. We've certainly enjoyed finding out about the insults of presidents past, and you know, we'll see what the future insults look like.
I'll be watching. So thanks everyone for tuning in, and thanks to the library for inviting me.
Well, thank you. And with that, we'll let everyone have a great rest of their evening. Bye-bye, folks.